A House Democrat introduced 7 articles of impeachment against President Trump. In this video, we'll explain the accusations and why President Trump won't be impeached in the next 2 years. The articles of impeachment introduced by Congressman Traitors accuse President Trump of obstruction of justice, abuse of executive power, bribery, corruption, and tyrannical overreach. Traitors says President Trump committed impeachable offenses by defying court orders, deporting immigrants without due process, and unlawfully creating the Department of Government Efficiency.
If we let this stand, we are saying the president is above the law, that the United States Constitution is optional.
President Trump won't be impeached nor removed from office as long as Republicans are in control of Congress. But the White House is preparing for a possible change in power after the 2026 midterm elections. A top Trump pollster and even Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent have said they believe Democrats would immediately move to impeach President Trump if they retook the majority.
Hey folks, welcome back. Adam is here. So what just happened, guys? With 13 articles of impeachment filed and over 70 lawmakers demanding his resignation, Trump's response was to grab his phone, find a gilded backdrop at Mar-a-Lago, and go live calling members of Congress traitors and enemies of the state. No Joint Chiefs, no cabinet meeting, just a live stream labeling elected officials as enemies while the institutional walls close in around him.
The backlash is growing in Washington after President Trump called 6 Democratic veterans in Congress traitors who should face the death penalty.
The comments came after the lawmakers released a video telling service members that they can refuse illegal orders.
This puts all of our lives in jeopardy. Democrats in the Congress are on the phone with their chiefs of staff, beefing up our security for this weekend and next week because the president has a lot of unhinged supporters.
That kind of rhetoric isn't good. It stirs up people among us who may not be stable.
The White House says the president does not want to execute anyone, but argues the lawmakers' video was irresponsible.
That's not a soundbite. That's a president in freefall, and the media gave you the clip without showing you the collapse behind it. Let's reset the board, because the context here is not just important. It is the entire ballgame. We are in the thick of a moment that future textbooks will mark as the inflection point. Just one rotation of the Earth prior, Representative John Larson of Connecticut didn't just hold a press conference. He detonated a legal ordinance.
Connecticut Congressman John Larson, who is up for re-election, has filed articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump. Larson says the move comes amid the unrest in the Middle East and the president's comments on social media recently this week. Fox 61's Joe Monte has more on the move and an update on the war in Iran. And we made a bit of a breakthrough last night, Joe, in terms of a temporary ceasefire. Tell us about that.
Good morning, Bridget. Yeah, a lot of major updates over the course of the last 12 hours last night in Iran and at home with some of our local leaders. I'll start with John Larson. He filed articles of impeachment against the president, and he's also calling on the president's cabinet following this Iran war and some of the president's statements in recent times regarding Iran, some of the threats that he's made. He's calling to invoke the 25th Amendment. Now, what this would mean is that the vice president would basically take power, and this is typically used when the president dies or resigns or cannot discharge their duties.
He walked into the chamber and formally deposited 13 articles of impeachment, a document that explicitly cites a social media post as evidence of intent to erase an entire civilization. The post in question was not a leak. It was not a rumor. It was a direct statement typed out and published by the president regarding a foreign nation. And on this particular day, the dam didn't just leak, it shattered. It ceased to be a partisan exercise.
Now, Larson is calling for this because he says the president is putting our security at risk. Senator Chris Murphy joined in on these calls. Take a listen.
The president has promised to commit war crimes. He's promised to eradicate an entire civilization. We have never, ever seen that in the history of this country. That's why I and many other people have been talking for the last 24 hours about the 25th Amendment.
Now, yesterday, the president reached a historic deal with Iran for what he calls a complete, immediate, and safe opening to the Strait of Hormuz. They've also reached a 2-week ceasefire, and Iran submitted a 10-point plan for peace, and President Trump says that it's a workable basis to negotiate, and ultimately, the goal is for long-term peace in Iran and the...
It morphed into something much more dangerous for the occupant of the White House. It became a chorus. More than 70 lawmakers, a number that strains the very definition of fringe minority, stood up one by one and went on the record. They didn't ask for a hearing. They didn't request a polite review of policy. They demanded the immediate, unconditional resignation of the President of the United States. Not at the end of the term. Not after an election cycle. Now. Today. Vacate the West Wing. That kind of synchronized cross-aisle discomfort is not a hiccup. It's a cardiac event for an administration. It's the kind of thing that makes seasoned political operatives drop their coffee cups because it signals that the back-channel safety nets have vanished. And the response? Oh, the response is the tell. In a rational world, when confronted with a constitutional mutiny of this magnitude, a leader leans on the machinery of the office. There is a measured, lawyer-vetted statement. There is a calm, strategic silence that implies control. But that is not what happened. Instead of letting the press secretary handle the incoming fire, the president himself stepped into the frame, unscripted, raw, and visibly vibrating with a frequency of fury. He didn't just dispute the charges. He attacked the very legitimacy of the people bringing them. He branded the 70-plus members of Congress traitors. He proclaimed with a conviction that sent chills down the spines of constitutional scholars that his term concludes precisely when he decides it concludes, and he swore, with the volume cranked to maximum, that he would never, ever relinquish the gavel voluntarily. Now, there is a segment of the population that watched that video and felt a surge of adrenaline. They saw defiance. They saw the alpha dog biting back against the bureaucratic machine. They saw strength. And honestly, if you're in that bubble, I get the visceral appeal of watching someone punch back. But there is a secondary, far more critical reading of that footage that the political class is whispering about in the private rooms of Capitol Hill and the cocktail circuits of D.C. That video is not a portrait of strength. It is a diagnostic image of a pressure cooker about to blow its lid. It is the response of a man who feels the floorboards splintering beneath his feet. When you are in total command of the chessboard, you don't scream at the pawns, you move them. The act of going live to yell at the top of your lungs is the political equivalent of a cornered animal's instinct. It's not a strategy, it's a reflex. And for the staffers and advisors who are desperately trying to navigate the actual legal and geopolitical minefield, the ones who know that blockading the Strait of Hormuz has real-world implications on global markets, and that genocidal intent is now a phrase living in the congressional record, that video was a nightmare. It is the president undercutting his own defense team with a bullhorn. What we are staring at is an unprecedented stack of dominoes, all lined up and quivering. You have the 70-plus resignation ultimatums. You have the baker's dozen of impeachment articles already locked and loaded. You have the president's own words now being entered as Exhibit A in the case against his mental fitness for the office. The prediction markets, those cold, unsentimental arbiters of political survival, are no longer pricing this as a 0% chance event. And then there is the shadow war, the ongoing military engagement in the Gulf, the seizure of the world's most vital oil artery, all of it unfolding without a single vote of authorization from the people's representatives. That is the stack of bricks sitting on the Resolute desk. Calling it a crisis feels like calling a tsunami a puddle. All right, let's strip away the theatrical fog and get into the engine room of this story, because the surface-level screaming match is the least interesting layer of this onion. The real intrigue, the stuff that determines whether a presidency stands or falls, is happening in the quiet mechanics of the Capitol and the whisper networks of the Republican conference. Most people are missing the forest for the trees. They see 70 people yelling "resign" and they file it under political theater. And yes, some of it is. The fundraising emails will fly, the clips will be run on cable news. But this particular storm is unique because of its density and its texture. Let's talk about scale first. In the modern era, a president facing calls for resignation from 5 or 10 members of the opposition is a Tuesday. 70 plus in a single news cycle, that is a seismic event. That is a substantial block of the legislative branch effectively declaring the executive branch compromised. They aren't just saying he made a bad call on Iran. They are saying he is fundamentally unable to continue. And when you pair that with the formal filing of 13 impeachment articles the day before, you realize this isn't about ousting him tomorrow. This is about creating a permanent, indelible marker in the sand. It's about building a historical record that will be weaponized during the next election cycle. It's about making sure that every single member of Congress has to answer a simple yes or no question, eventually. Where did you stand when the president called his colleagues traitors? And that brings us to the bipartisan texture, which is the most fragile but most explosive element in this whole mix. Let's be crystal clear. The majority of the 70 voices are Democrats. That's the partisan math. But if you listen closely, through the static of the cable news shouting, you hear a different sound. It's the sound of Republican members clearing their throats. It's the sound of carefully worded statements that express concern over the war powers situation. It's the sound of silence from corners of the conference that are usually the loudest. This is not a revolt. It is a slow, deliberate step backward from the president. And in politics, distance is the first stage of abandonment. When Republican members of Congress start to treat the president's words as a political liability they must manage rather than a rallying cry they must amplify, the foundation of his power begins to shift. The White House political team knows this math better than anyone. They know which members are in competitive seats. They know that having to defend a live video screaming traitor at fellow Americans while gas prices spike due to an unauthorized blockade is a political death wish for a moderate. That's why the response from Mar-a-Lago was so unhinged. Calm confidence comes from a position of unassailable political leverage. Screaming comes from a place where the political math is turning sour. We also have to dissect what the resignation demands actually do to the internal cohesion of the GOP caucus. This is the silent killer in this narrative. Every single Republican in the House and Senate now faces a trilemma. Do you stand shoulder to shoulder with the president and defend the traitor label and the civilization post? That might secure your primary, but it paints a massive target on your back for the general election. Do you stay completely silent and hope the storm passes? That makes you look like a coward who lacks the spine to speak truth to power, satisfying absolutely no one. Or do you issue a mild statement of concern that criticizes the tone but not the substance? That's the worst of both worlds. It enrages the base who demand total loyalty, and it looks like a weak half measure to the opposition. There is no clean exit, and when a political party finds itself in a maze with no clean exits, its members start looking for someone else to lead the way. That's not a prediction of a palace coup. It's a recognition that the political weight of carrying this particular version of Donald Trump into a general election campaign is beginning to crush some of the rank and file. Now, let's zoom in on the Mar-a-Lago video with the precision of a forensic analyst, because the language used there matters profoundly. When the President of the United States uses the word traitor, he is not describing a policy dispute. He is not saying, "I disagree with their economic plan." He is applying a term reserved for Benedict Arnold. He is accusing elected representatives of high treason for exercising their constitutional oversight authority. Think about the circular logic of this for a moment. The impeachment articles argue that the president is unfit because he has authoritarian tendencies and a disregard for democratic norms. In response to this accusation, the president goes on live television and declares that members of Congress who hold him accountable are betraying the country. He is, in real time, providing Exhibit B, C, and D to support the very case he is trying to debunk. It's a legal self-own of epic proportions. And you can bet that somewhere in the labyrinth of the White House counsel's office, there are lawyers staring at the wall in silent, abject horror. And then there is the phrase that lingers in the air like smoke after the fire is out. My term ends when I say it ends. On first listen, it sounds like a tough guy line from a movie. It sounds like a clapback to the haters. But in the context of a president facing formal removal proceedings and military escalation, it sounds like something else entirely. It sounds like a fundamental rejection of the Constitution's mechanism for the transfer of power. It sounds like a man who is either intentionally testing the tensile strength of American democracy or who has simply forgotten that he works for us, not the other way around. And in this hypercharged environment, where every syllable is being parsed by both allies and adversaries on the global stage, that kind of rhetorical drift is not just sloppy. It is alarming. It gets filed away in the mental dossiers of foreign intelligence agencies and domestic political rivals under the heading, "He might actually try it." Here's a critical piece that's been buried under the avalanche of he said, she said coverage, the transformation of a social media post into a formal legal document. Most folks don't grasp the gravity of this shift. When John Larson filed those 13 articles and specifically cited the president's post about a civilization dying tonight, he performed a kind of political alchemy. He took ephemeral digital rage and transmuted it into permanent congressional evidence. That post is no longer just a controversial tweet. It is now a certified piece of the legal argument for removal from office. It sits in the official government archive. And here's the trap. Every single subsequent comment Trump makes about it, every live video, every angry retort, every new post calling his opponents traitors, is simply more fuel being added to that same legal fire. The communications team cannot turn off the spigot of this evidence. Every time the principal grabs the microphone to vent, he is potentially handing over another page to the prosecution. It's like watching a defendant fire his own lawyer and then deliver a closing argument that confesses to the crime. We also need to touch on the shadow of the 25th Amendment. The resignation demands are a public pressure campaign. They are political theater with sharp teeth. But the whispers about the 25th Amendment are different. They are a specific constitutional lever. Section 4 outlines a process where the vice president and a majority of the cabinet can declare the president unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. If that happens, power shifts instantly to the VP. The president can protest, but then it goes to Congress, and it requires a supermajority vote to permanently settle. That bar is impossibly high in the current climate. But the fact that lawmakers are even using that specific language, unfit to serve, means they are arguing that the issue isn't just bad policy, it's a cognitive or psychological impairment. Once that stain is on the public record, it is incredibly difficult to wash off. It changes the conversation from, "What should we do about Iran?" to, "Is this man capable of making any rational decision?" Let's bring this in for a landing and sift through the wreckage to see what actually matters for the road ahead. Point number 1. The screaming did more damage than good. I know the base loves the fight. I know the base sees a warrior refusing to bow to the swamp. But in the cold calculus of governance and legal survival, that video was a gift to the opposition. It solidified the narrative that this is a president operating on pure, unhinged ID. It forced Republicans into the uncomfortable position of having to defend the indefensible, the act of calling fellow Americans traitors for doing their jobs. That's a heavy political anchor to drag into a campaign season, and the weight of that anchor only increases over time. The video didn't extinguish the fire, it doused it with lighter fluid. Point number 2. The faint whispers of bipartisanship are the canary in the coal mine. If this remains a purely Democratic lynch mob, the barricades around the White House will hold. Impeachment requires a House majority. Conviction requires 2/3 of the Senate. Those numbers don't exist in a vacuum. But watch the economic dashboard. Watch the pain at the gas pump. Watch the fallout from the Strait of Hormuz blockade. If that pain hits the wallets of voters in swing districts, the silence from Republican members will become deafening. They don't have to vote to remove him. They just have to stop protecting him. They just have to allow the narrative of chaos to stick. The goal of these 70-plus resignation demands isn't necessarily to see Trump walk out the door next week. It's to ensure that he is politically paralyzed, that the White House is in a permanent defensive crouch, and that every Republican on the ballot has to answer for the traitor video. Point number 3. The economic tidal wave is coming, and it does not care about your political affiliation. The blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is not an abstract geopolitical chess move. It is a chokehold on roughly 20% of the planet's oil flow. That means higher energy prices. That means higher shipping costs. That means everything you buy, from bread to batteries, gets more expensive. And when the kitchen table conversation in Ohio or Pennsylvania turns from constitutional crisis to why is my grocery bill up $300 this month, the political dynamics shift violently. Voters who might have cheered the tough talk against Iran will suddenly realize that they are paying for that tough talk out of their own pockets. And when they ask their representatives why this is happening, my term ends when I say it ends is not going to cover the rent. Point number 4. The paper trail is forever. We are living through a period of history that is being documented in real time at a granular, often brutal level. 13 articles of impeachment are now part of the permanent record. Over 70 formal resignation demands are etched into the history books. Social media posts are being treated as evidence of genocidal intent, and the response to all of this is a video of the president screaming, "Traitor." This record will outlast all of us. It will outlast this news cycle. It will be the raw material for historians, legal scholars, and future politicians for the next century. And in the immediate term, it is the ultimate oppo file. Every Democratic candidate now has a script handed to them on a silver platter. They don't need to spin, they don't need to exaggerate, they just need to press play on the clip. The record is damning enough on its own merits. So, what is the trajectory from here? The impeachment articles will grind through the committee process, and at every juncture, every member of the House will be forced to show their cards. The legal challenges to the military blockade will wind their way through the federal courts, potentially creating sudden, jarring interruptions to the president's plans. The economic ripples from the Gulf will continue to spread outward, touching every corner of the economy. And the political climate will continue to be defined by a president who, when cornered, defaults to screaming rather than strategizing. Because that is the ultimate irony of this approach. It feels like dominance. It feels like control. But it is actually the opposite. It is the outward manifestation of a loss of control. It is a man confirming in the loudest possible voice the very story that his enemies are telling about him. And that story, the one being formalized by those 13 articles and 70-plus voices, is that lines have been crossed that cannot be walked back. A live video calling lawmakers traitors does not redraw those lines. It just digs the trench deeper. This story is compounding, chapter by chaotic chapter, and we are nowhere near the final page. If this analysis sharpened your view of the blurry mess we're seeing on the news, hit that like button. Tell me in the comments, do you think the economic pressure from the blockade will be the thing that finally fractures the GOP's wall of support? Or is this just another storm they'll weather? And make sure you're subscribed with notifications on because this narrative is mutating faster than the press can keep up. We'll see you in the next deep dive. Here's the connective tissue that binds this entire messy, screaming, historic moment together. We are not merely watching a political brawl. We are watching a pressure test of the American operating system. The Constitution is very clear on the division of war powers. It vests the power of the sword in Congress, the power to declare, to authorize, to fund. It vests command in the president. But it absolutely, unequivocally, does not grant the president the unilateral authority to blockade a global shipping lane, threaten to erase a nation from the map via social media, and sustain a military campaign without ever darkening the door of the House or Senate chambers to ask for permission. That is the stress test. And right now, Congress is responding to the breach by reaching for the only tools it has: impeachment and the public shaming of resignation demands. The presidency is responding by pointing a camera at its own face and roaring into the void. And the courts are waiting in the wings. And the world is watching to see if the guardrails of this 200-year-old experiment will hold back the weight of one man's ego. Let's talk about the actual, practical, gut-level reality of a resignation demand in this climate. We all know it's a long shot. It's a moonshot. Presidential resignation is the white whale of American politics, seen once in 1974 when the Republican elders marched into the Oval Office and told Nixon the game was up. That's the benchmark. That requires the party leadership to turn on their own, and we are not there, not even close. But the resignation demands are not useless simply because they fail. They serve as a moral and political cudgel. They set the standard for what is acceptable, and they will be used to bludgeon every Republican who had the opportunity to demand accountability and chose instead to offer silence or excuses. It's a benchmark for future judgment. And then there is the fog of war, the actual war that is unfolding in the shadows of this political circus. The ceasefire is a ghost, the operation grinds on, the strait remains a choke point, and every tick of the clock adds to the economic pressure cooker. Every day that passes without a resolution is another day of allies fuming in private and markets jittering in public. Trump going live and screaming traitor does nothing to unblock the oil flow. It does nothing to de-escalate the military tension. It simply occupies the news cycle. And while occupying the news cycle is a form of political warfare, it is a tactical maneuver in a strategic war that is being lost. The bill comes due eventually. The resolution of this crisis, whether through the courts, the ballot box, or the markets, will happen. The question is whether it happens on terms that salvage the institution of the presidency or on terms that break it. I keep circling back to that word, traitor. When you weaponize that word against your own government's representatives for performing oversight, you are not just being mean, you are redefining loyalty. You are suggesting that loyalty to the Constitution is somehow treasonous to the man. That is an inversion of the oath of office. It is a premise that, if allowed to stand without challenge, corrodes the very concept of checks and balances. It's the kind of statement that makes the unfit argument self-evident. The next few weeks are the crucible. Watch closely how the Republican conference handles the traitor comment. Do they nod along? Do they adopt the rhetoric of betrayal? If they do, the political walls remain fortified. But if they flinch, if even a handful of them say, "I support the president, but I wouldn't use that word for my colleagues," then you will have seen the first hairline fracture. And in politics, as in engineering, a hairline fracture under enough pressure leads to a catastrophic failure. That's the map of the battlefield. We will be here, chronicling every maneuver, every slip, and every scream. Hit that like button if you value context over clickbait. Subscribe so you don't miss the next turn in this labyrinth. And drop a comment below. Is the traitor video a bridge too far or just another day at the office for this administration? I want to hear your perspective. We'll connect the next set of dots in the video that follows. I'll see you there.